Welcome back, everybody. This is Rodrigo of Montford with Asheville Real Estate News. Really excited to talk to you guys about what happens with real property and a couple of variables around real estate when it comes to being married or not being married, and what those variables are when you're going through a divorce or you purchased a house and then you get married, or you decide to purchase a house after you're married, etc. North Carolina has some interesting components on how things are distributed and how ownership is titled, and so really excited to get into that today. Joined by Jacob Ehrmann, who's an attorney here in town at Montford Family Law. Jacob, thank you.
Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, absolutely. But before we get into all of that, is Asheville home for you, and how long, and how'd you end up here?
I moved here in '99 after school, and I was a legal aid attorney at Pisgah Legal Services for about 4 years, and primarily focused on domestic violence cases during that time. And when I left in '04, it seemed like a logical step to continue in kind of family law. And then in '08, I became a law specialist here, and now I'm part of Montford Family Law, where you've got 3 family law specialists and a new attorney on her way to becoming a specialist. So we focus primarily, almost exclusively, in fact, on family law issues in Western North Carolina.
Yeah, that's it's a very unique area of practice, and I'm sure that the stories are plentiful.
They are. Yeah.
How'd you end up deciding that family law was your niche, or did you kind of fall into it by accident?
Well, I think some family law specialists had a lot more agency in their lives than I did. It would just seem like one logical step after another versus part of a long-term plan where I was like, that's where I want to end up being.
Fair enough.
But it's rewarding. You get to help people during difficult times.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure that some of the emotional wear and tear is up there.
It can be.
No doubt. Well, today, wanted to talk a little bit about, real estate, and a lot of times, houses are very emotional purchases,
right,
and dealing with real property is really emotional. And I know that the division of property after you've been married, depending how you buy it, and there's a lot of variables that come into play. And so I was hoping maybe you could take us from the top, give us a brief explanation in general, and then we can get into the specifics with real estate.
Be happy to. Here in North Carolina, we divide property between married people pursuant to the equitable distribution statute. And probably some broad strokes about equitable distribution will make the conversation about real estate a little bit more
give it context?
Absolutely, thanks. So you're right about the house. Usually the 2 biggest assets, not always, but usually the 2 biggest assets to divide in a divorce are the retirement and the home.
Right.
And the home is where children may have grown up or may be growing up. And so you're right to say that there's a lot tied up into the house. But in broad strokes in equitable distribution, what the court is trying to do, and these are the principles that lawyers look at, even if you're trying to do an agreement that's private and outside of the courtroom.
Okay.
The judge would look at the principles of, what property exists on the date of separation, and then classify that property. So it's identify, classify, and then we want to put a value on that property, and then ultimately divide that property in an equitable way.
Okay.
And in North Carolina, the law presumes that a equal division or a 50-50 division of the net value statute provides certain factors to do that, but by and large, courts are going to follow the presumption and do a 50-50 split. So in the case of real estate,
can we back before we get into
sure.
that? How do you define the value in real estate? Unless you're about to get into that right now, but.
Well, valuation's a big issue. It's one of the 4 issues of equitable distribution, and what we're looking at is fair market value on the date of separation. And so generally we're looking at hiring competent appraisers who know the area, know the value, and then give us their expert opinion on what that value is.
Okay, thanks.
So once we have that value, the idea is, do the parties want to sell the house? Is there equity? After the real estate collapse, there were a lot of houses that had zero equity.
Yeah.
And it was more of an albatross to take at that time. But we're certainly in a different period now. And so the question is to value that equity. And so we get that expert appraisal, we look at what the debt on the house is, and now we have a number. So if we were going to, for the sake of this conversation, have an equitable distribution issue where there was only a house, there's no other assets, we would be looking at what's the equity in that house, and then is it a situation where someone wants to buy the other person out of that equity?
So that they can keep the house?
Correct. And so just to make up some numbers, let's say that the house is worth $200,000 and $100,000 debt. Nice and easy, there's $100,000 of equity. If someone's going to keep the house, then the question becomes how to give the other spouse $50,000 would be the basic idea.
Right.
And that might be through a refi. It may be that there are other assets to offset that, or it may be a situation where the house needs to be sold so the parties can divide
Get
their
cash
equity.
and just walk away.
Right.
When you're having those conversations, is there anything that impacts those conversations that somebody does when they're buying the house? Kind of just referring to, like, let's say I buy a house and then I get married. I know if I wanted to sell it, my spouse would have to sign off on the deed, but what happens if we get a divorce? Then would it be the same thing? Would they marry have 50%?
So in your scenario, you're buying a house before you get married, and then you have the house while you get married, and then you continue to make payments on the house during the marriage, and now you're separating.
Right.
Well, under that situation, we're looking at a mixed sort of asset. Your equity that you acquired prior to your date of marriage is what's called your equity, and that's the part that the court would then look to split 50-50.
So then you'd only be splitting the equity that exists in the property from the date of the marriage to the date of separation.
Assuming title hasn't changed, and we'll talk about that in a second.
Okay.
But just to clarify the point, if we go back to my $100,000 equity example, but it turns out we get a retroactive appraisal to the date of your marriage, and it shows you had $20,000 of equity at the time.
Right.
We would then take that $100,000 minus the 20. You're looking at 80, and now we're looking at if you're going to remain in the house, how do you provide your spouse $40,000?
Okay.
So by and large, and there's some exceptions to this, but by and large, when the court's dividing marital property, the court doesn't really care too much about how property's titled.
Right.
They're really interested in was the property acquired during the marriage, no matter whose name it's held in, and existed on the date of separation. The biggest exception to that is real property.
Okay.
And the idea is if you had your house premarital, you had your $20,000 in it, but during your marriage you retitle the property in a special type of ownership that only married people can have, called tenancy by the entireties.
Right.
There's a presumption then that you have gifted your premarital money to the marriage.
And what about if I never retitle it?
I think you have a valid argument that you had $20,000 of premarital property there.
Okay. But then you'd still be dividing up the equity from marriage to this point.
And so, you may have bought the house before you got married, but as we all know, the bank owns the property until you pay it off.
Right.
And so when you have that house and you've owned it before you got married, we're really looking at what's the pay down on the debt and the increase in equity during the marriage.
So just to be clear on this, right? I buy a house, I'm single, I get married 5 years later, then I'm married, I want to go sell the house 10 years after my marriage date. Does my wife need to sign off on the documents at that point in time? Or my spouse?
I don't know from a non-divorce perspective how real estate lawyers handle that, but from personal experience, I think I recall in a situation where some people did have to sign off on it, even though they weren't really titled to it.
So in the divorce situation, though, it's assumed that the spouse has interest in the property, right? Like that's why you're having the conversation of splitting the equity.
Yes, so all property in an equitable distribution context, all property that exists on the date of separation, there's a presumption that that's marital.
Okay.
And the person that wants to say, no, I had $20,000 in the house before we got married, they have the responsibility of demonstrating
Prove
that.
it, essentially.
And if you don't bring forth some evidence showing you have the 20 grand, all of it's going to be presumed to be marital.
Okay. Going on as far as, the spouse, say what happens if you're going into foreclosure? How does that get ironed out? Is it the same, but just reverse? So let's say I buy the house, I had that 80K of equity, but for whatever reason, as a couple, we stopped making payments on the house. I'm the only person on title because we haven't done the tenancy in common. Does the foreclosure go against both partners?
I don't know the answer
not 100%
to that.
sure on that one?
I would think that under your scenario, you're the only one that's titled, you're the only one that's signed the deed of trust,
So
it'd be coming against you, but I don't know the answer to your
Gotcha.
question, whether
Okay.
they would make your spouse party to it or not.
So many variables there, aren't there?
Yeah. So there's some really good real estate lawyers
Yeah.
in town, and anytime I have a question that I don't know, I'm quick to pick up the phone call and
Try to get that.
some very helpful people in town that can answer those types of questions.
Well, it kind of leads me into the other topics I just wanted to touch on, briefly is, getting a prenup or a postnup. I know some of the language in those agreements can kind of answer those questions ahead of time, essentially.
They can.
I mean, I'm not very knowledgeable, but that's my understanding.
No, you're right. The law allows both before you get married, or even during your marriage and after your marriage, to resolve these property issues. Now, there's different sort of rules on when you do it before you're married and while you're married and when you're separated. But they all basically allow people to privately contract to resolve these issues outside of the court. And oftentimes, when those documents are being drafted, especially in the case of a separation agreement, we go back and look at the rules that we've been talking about to see what would be a fair settlement.
Gotcha.
And so we still kind of do the same analysis with the idea being why go to court when we agree on the facts and it's presumed to be a 50-50 split. But also the benefit of a separation agreement or any of these agreements is a private.
Yeah.
When a court hears an equitable distribution case, it's a public forum.
Right.
Some people would prefer to handle their issues in private.
Yeah, behind closed doors. No doubt.
Right.
What would you say? Are you an advocate, I'm guessing, for prenups and whatnot? Or is that even a fair question? Is that something?
I certainly do prenuptial agreements. That's an interesting question.
Well, let me put it to you different, right?
Yeah.
In separation cases or divorce cases that you've worked on, the ones that have prenups, do they tend to go smoother than not?
Probably the prenuptial agreements that work really well that I had nothing to do with.
Yeah.
I never hear about them because they don't come in the door.
Because
all right, they just follow the rules of the prenup, and that's the way it works. But I've been involved in many cases where more issues arise out of the drafting of the prenuptial agreement that I don't have ready questions for. That require a fair amount of homework to figure out how is this going to play out versus the basic rules. But I do think that there's something to be said for both parties taking agency and saying this is how we want to live our lives. And the law certainly allows that.
What are a couple of questions that you'd recommend somebody to ask themselves when they're thinking about, maybe getting one of these agreements if there's real property involved?
Well, I would suggest they ask themselves first, why are they getting married? If they really want, you can basically contract out of everything that we think of as a marriage.
Right.
And so that begs the question, why would someone enter an institution that they want to contract out of? But there's going to be some really valid reasons for that. For example, second marriages where you'd like your kids from your first marriage to inherit, clarity. Another advantage of a premarital agreement is laws change. And you don't know what the law is going to be 20 years from now when you separate. And so you can have clarity that this is how we're going to handle our business should that event happen. Now, just because we have equitable distribution, we have these rules, parties are free to do whatever they want.
Right.
And so that's the guideline that I use, and I think most lawyers use to advise clients. But sometimes people come in with prenups because they want their spouse to get more under certain situations. And so people have all types of varieties of reasons for wanting to do that.
All over the spectrum.
Right.
With equitable distribution, is there anything that the layperson should be aware of when they're, thinking about getting married and just like having an idea of what that actually means when they get married?
Well, I don't know if there's something necessarily like they should pause and think about, but I can give you the rationale for equitable distribution.
Okay.
All right, it came around in 1981, and in my opinion, it's a product. This was going on throughout the country, but the 70s there was a lot of advancement for women, and I think that equitable distribution is a product of that, because prior to equitable distribution, title ruled, and so if we want to go back in time and stereotype a lot. Prior to 81, a lot of marriages involved the woman staying home, potentially raising kids and taking care of the home, and the man out in the workforce. Now, that obviously didn't cover everyone, but it covered a lot of people. Yeah. So what ended up happening in that situation was the contribution of the stay-at-home parent could be seen as devalued. And so how to compensate for that is to look at a marriage as an economic team. So for example, if we did have a stereotypical wife staying at home, well, you're not paying someone to raise your kids. You've got someone who's taking care of the household and everything that you're not paying to do. Right. And so at the end of the day, you have more money on your date of separation because you weren't providing these services. So that's really the gist of why equitable distribution looks to identify property acquired during the marriage, value it, and split it evenly, even though the court can deviate from that 50-50 split, because we're trying to recognize marriage is an economic partnership. It rises together, and in a lot of ways it falls together. So if there was a lot of debt that was for marital purposes, that's going to get divided as well. And so it's really meant to recognize and value everyone's contribution to the marriage, when historically that wasn't the case.
Get it all on a level playing field, per se.
Sure.
Okay. And then one last question here as we finish up. Really interested to know if you have an opinion on whether what's the benefit or not the benefit of retitling property and putting your spouse on it.
Well, the rationale originally, and the statute has changed, but originally there was a case called McLean, and it's the case that stood for the idea that property with a premarital component, separate component, that's titled by tenancy by the entireties, is going to be presumed as a gift to the marriage. Is based on the idea that there's some special attributes to tenancy by the entireties properties. Namely, if someone owns a house with their spouse by tenancy in the entireties, and let's say the husband has a judgment against him from a creditor, the creditor can't move on the house unless the creditor has the wife on the debt as well. And so that's a built-in protection. So under the case law, the idea was like, look, if you're going to protect this asset from the entire world,
you have to make it known.
Well, you make it known by the tenancy by the entireties, but once you have the benefit of having that protection, then you get in the divorce and say, oh no, it's really mine. We're going to say, no, I don't.
Can't go both ways on that one. Gotcha. Okay, yeah, that's
so if you're looking for credit protection, that would be a reason to do that. And then with the understanding that by doing that, if there was a significant premarital portion, that is most likely in the case of a divorce going to be seen as a gift to the marriage.
Gotcha.
What happened a lot for a while, I don't think this is happening now, but people would refi their house during their marriage and have no idea when the title got changed on the refi that they were gifting their marriage. And now, divorce lawyers got to be the depending on which side.
Bad news or good news, I guess.
But yeah, that's kind of the analysis there. Is it's most likely, if you end up getting divorced, going to be seen as a marital asset. Of course, you could contract out of that.
That makes sense. Well, Jacob, thank you so much. It's been really good information. Where's a good place for somebody to get connected with you, or if they're had some more in-depth questions we didn't cover that they might be able to
happy to. Again, there's 3 specialists here and another one on her way. Any of us would be happy to talk with anybody. Best number is 828-505-7081.
Cool.
Or you can reach us at www.montfordfamilylaw.com.
Cool, awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing.
I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, man, absolutely. All right, y'all, thanks so much for tuning in. Don't forget to share or tag somebody in this video who you might, maybe you've had this conversation with them and you think that this information could be useful. Remember, we're on Apple Podcasts, we're on Spotify now, Google Play, anywhere on social media that you're hanging out, that's where we're at as well. Let us know how we're doing. Thank you all.